The following program is brought to you by Bruce Telecom and Whiteman TV.
So, a little bit about Charles Wilkens. The full title of Charles' talk was to be Little Ship of Fools, 16 Rowers, One Improbable Boat, 7 Tumultuous Weeks on the Atlantic. Charles Wilkens is the author of 15 books, including The Circus at the Edge of the Earth, about his travels with the Great Wallenda Circus, Walk to New York, about his 2002 walk from Thunder Bay to New York City, and In the Land of Long Fingernails, a memoir about a summer he spent working in a large Toronto cemetery. He is the co-author of 2 international bestsellers, Paddle to the Amazon and After the Applause. In 2011, Wilkens undertook the most exhilarating and daring of his numerous adventures as a writer. At the age of 63, he joined a crew of 16, and after a year of intense training, rowed across the Atlantic Ocean in a fragile, experimental rowboat. He was motivated, in his own words, by a lifelong fascination with exotic travel, by a deep curiosity about the planet, and by a question: what would happen if, rather than merely enduring risk and uncertainty as we add years, we decided instead to embrace risk, to juice up on it, reclaim our bodies, re-establish ground? The result of that Atlantic crossing is Wilkens' most recent book, Little Ship of Fools, published by Greystone Books. 4 of Charles' books have been named to the Globe and Mail's annual top 100 books. In 1999, 2001, 2004, 2008. And he has won 5 national magazine awards, along with many other awards. He has 3 children and divides his time between Thunder Bay on the north shore of Lake Superior and his cabin in Muskoka, Ontario. Please help me welcome our guest, our brave, courageous, foolhardy, adventurous guest, Charles Wilkens.
Thanks very much, Susan. I've been encouraged to hold the microphone quite close to my chin so that everybody can hear. I want to say a few things to you before we start. One of them is this, that just to give you a bit of a capsule sense of what went on here. In 2010, I heard about a rather magical kind of experimental rowboat that was being built in New York City. And a friend of mine, Steve Rohde, a doctor from St. Joseph Island, and his son Nigel were to be rowers on this boat. And when Steve told me about it, I thought, I want to be on that boat. The aim of the adventure, in ocean rowing kind of terms, was that it would go out there and cross the Atlantic from Morocco to Barbados more quickly than any other rowboat had ever done that. The aim was to be across in 33 days. Well, you know, there's an old Shakespearean line, many a slip twixt cup and lip. And once we got out there, all sorts of things happened that we did not anticipate. And, you know, after a lifetime of experiencing rain and snowstorms, we should know that weather is not very predictable, and it wasn't. And instead of taking 33 days, it took us 53 days. We were rowing round the clock at that point, 2 hours on, 2 hours off. Because of the extra time involved, we ran out of food, and I was losing about a pound a day anyway, so went from 170 pounds to 135. There were some other interesting privations involved. So having told you that, I just wanted to say one more thing, and it's this, or three little things. When I got back and started writing about this expedition I'd been on, it was so easy to sit in a room, as I do for about a year when I'm working on a book. I mean, I obviously go out and do other things, but basically my job during the year of writing is to be in a room more or less by myself, sorting out this book. And it was all quite easy to do that. As I wrote about this adventure, as soon as I stepped outside of that room, all the things that were sort of guarded within my heart and head about it all kind of went aflutter, because people immediately want to know why you would go out there with 15 strangers amid storms and sharks and possibly pirates and so forth, and basically risk your life over a period of 53 days when you didn't have to, when there were other ways to travel and so forth. And I came to realize that if I could not answer that question as to why one would do this, it sort of invalidated the whole thing. I wanted to know for myself why. So I thought about it quite a bit. And the first reason that came to mind, or comes to mind, always is a very simple one, and it's my long-standing affection for and fascination with the planet itself, with experiencing it, traveling it in unusual and compelling ways. And as a kind of subsidiary to that, an equal fascination with the importance of our connections to the planet, to water, to skies, to soil, to mountains, to landscapes, to whatever we connect to forests. And on the other hand, the catastrophe that ensues with disconnecting ourselves from the fundamentals of the planet. And the second reason was sort of harkens to what Susan said or mentioned, in the form of a question, like what would happen if, rather than merely enduring risk and uncertainty as we add years, we decided instead to embrace risk and uncertainty and to juice up on it and see what that did for us. People would then say, though, but why at 63? Why would you have not done this at some other point in your life? And as many of you know, thinking back, I would say that in my 20s, I probably didn't have the strength of mind to go out there and do such a thing. And in my 30s, I probably didn't have the imagination. And in my 40s, I didn't have the time because I was busy writing and raising kids and all of that. In my 50s, I still did not have what I have come to see as the all-important realization and acceptance that mortality is not a disease. It is not something to be either feared or even particularly respected. And the gist of the ripening moment for me with regards to this trip was simply to go and to see what an adventure might turn up in terms of our role in the great human comedy. There was one other thing that I wanted to mention, and I'm not going to talk the whole time. It was this. The sociologist in me, if there is one, was kind of curious about what would happen if we basically abandoned everything that we know about ourselves and consider to be our identity. And I'm talking about social status and financial status and professional status and everything in terms of physical requirements. We abandoned proper sleep and proper nutrition and privacy and all of these kind of circadian kind of rhythms that we cling to. What would happen if we did that, as we did out there on that boat? And the two things that happened were, one of them quite lovely. Amidst the crew, there was a very strong sense of camaraderie and mutual support developed over the course of time out there. On the other hand, it would often go the other way and turn into what I have come to consider a kind of an adult version of Lord of the Flies, in which people were selfish and aggressive and petty and argumentative and combative, right up to the point where we actually one night came to something that was pretty close to murder on board the boat. To start, I'm going to show you a little 7-minute videotape, or video. It's not a tape anymore, is it? No, there's no such thing as tape. Right. About my training. And it's a little piece called Life is But a Dream, and was made, of course, before I left. And one thing I noticed, the screen, or I won't blame the screen. This computer I'm using kind of extends the thing lengthwise, so you're going to see me in a more narrow-minded version of myself, I'm afraid. But we'll just put that up there right now, and you can see it. I hope. Dear friends, as some of you may have heard, I have committed myself to a dreamlike, possibly nightmarish adventure, by far the most exotic of my life, and I hope not the last, although I am in the process of putting my papers in order, just in case. 9 months from now, immediately after Christmas, I will be embarking from Tarfaya, a fishing village on the west coast of Morocco, with a crew of 12 oarsmen plus a captain and an electronics engineer, in an attempt to row across the Atlantic Ocean. Our destination will be Barbados, some 3,000 miles from our starting point, and our hope, or more specifically that of our captain, Roy Finley, is that we will cover the distance in 30 days, chopping 3 days off the existing record. I have no right to be there. I am, clearly, as you can see, a maturing writer, scrawny, not an elite athlete at all. Well, the others are all have athletic careers and are half my age, twice my size, twice my strength, 9 men, 3 women. And we're going out there and we're going to take on the Atlantic. Almost immediately, what I found was people started to say to me, "Oh, you can't do that," as they said when I walked to New York or when I traveled with the circus, which is what people had been telling me my whole life about a writing career. You can't do that. You can't just not do anything else and write for a living. It's when I'm actually on the roar that I have my best fantasies about what will happen out there. What I tend to dream about these things, I feel like the Inuit hunter sometimes, and who was a more courageous and honorable chap than I'll ever be, I'm sure. But the Inuit hunter dreamed the hunt. And if he did not dream the hunt, it didn't come to pass as it should. He didn't shoot the animals he was to shoot. And in a sense, in all my grand adventures, whether it was going out on the ships, on the Great Lakes and the sea, or whether it was walking from the middle of the continent to New York City, or this rowing venture, I had to dream them before I could go and do them. And the dream I had ultimately became the sort of the literal version of the trip, and things just kind of shaped up as the dream allowed me to believe they would. And which is why, in a sense, in part, I think I have no fear here. And I'm not a mystic by nature, but I do believe in the power of dream, and which is the power of the imagination. And these adventures appeal to my imagination in a huge way. There's a nightmare element to it. There's no proper food on board. There's no hot meals. There's no stored water. The desalination equipment can break down. You're out of water. Your rudder breaks. You're out there in the Atlantic. You got to be picked up by a tramp steamer, by pirates. Who knows? You're eaten by sharks. Whatever happens. Clause 3 in my contract with Shelter Island Boats. Clause 3 is that if I croak out there, it's immediate burial at sea. And when I read that, I thought, okay, that puts it in perspective. And although as a guy with a sense of irony, I rather like the notion of it being immediate, no waiting, you know. But so there's this nightmarish quality to it, and there are no facilities, of course, conveniences, to use the euphemism. People who've made these trips always can be counted upon to comment on the sharks that invariably come out of the depths when somebody is doing their business over the ocean. And big sharks, white sharks, blue sharks, whatever. As a counterpoint, though, to all this kind of potential fear or trauma, I see another version of it. And in that version, we are out there in the middle of the night, and we have been picked up by the trade currents. We're on these enormous ocean waves. You pick up a wave like a surfer, and you start to sled. And I heard it described by one rower as being more thrilling and scarier than the most thrilling and scary roller coaster on Earth, except that it goes on for hours. At first I thought of this adventure in part as my last great adventure. I had to stop thinking that way because there was a kind of fatalism to it that I didn't like, so I merely think about it now as another big adventure and not the last one because, you know, there's nothing terminal about it. I hope. one thing I wanted to do, I'm going to read you two little passages out of the book at strategic times during our time together. And the first is from the preface to the book, and it will just give you a bit of an idea about a sense of things that maybe don't come from my patter about the slides and so forth. And I point out at a certain point in the prelude, I wish to say that I no longer think of our epic travels as a journey in the strictest sense of the word. I recall them rather as a kind of fable, a nuthouse opera, written not by cynics or pessimists who to my mind miss the point. And we had a lot of cynics and pessimists out there once we fell behind, because some people were only out there to set this world record. And once it was clearly lost, we had to do something else. And in some ways, I don't like to toot my own horn on this too much, but I felt that my attitude toward it was perhaps made it easier for me to adjust to the new reality. Written not by cynics or pessimists who to my mind miss the point, but by dreamers, by stargazers, by minstrels. I recall the fable's jittery, soulful currents, its nightmares and eloquence, the worst and best of it captured indelibly for me by an incident that occurred on January 29th, 2011, amidst seas so high that for hours they had been threatening to knock us off our rowing seats. We'd be rowing 8 of us at a time out there in the middle of the night while the other 8 slept in the cabin, or tried to sleep. Amid seas so high that for hours they had been threatening to knock us off our rowing seats. Just after 2 a.m., word came up from the captain's quarters, a fusty little spook hole in the cabin of our experimental rowboat, that we were through for the night and should quit rowing and try to get some rest. Now, this only happened once or twice in the whole 53 days we were out there. We never stopped rowing, but sometimes if the wind and waves were so hard straight into our prow that we were losing ground, there was no reason to keep on doing it. For a few seconds, having shipped my oar, I slumped forward in the seat and stared blindly into the rowing trench beneath me. We were just 19 days out of our starting port of Agadir, Morocco, and already I was down 20 pounds and was losing strength, and didn't know what to do about it. I hadn't brought enough food, or the right food. This will be explained later. I had come aboard as a kind of test of what was possible for a guy my age, a test that at that moment I was failing with flying colors. Meanwhile, the fog was so dense, the night so black, that even with the deck lights on, we could barely see our own feet. Nevertheless, within minutes, we had unpacked the sea anchor. This is what we did on those rare occasions when it was too difficult to move forward. The sea anchor, a colossal underwater parachute, and had pitched it over the bow on 200 yards of line. Even on a night so unruly, the anchor could pretty much neutralize the drifting of the boat. By the luck of the draw that night, I was among the first 4 chosen for watch duty, and was given the initial shift alone. And so I took my place on the bridge, while a dozen others slept in the cabin and my watchmates took to the holds. I mentioned 14 people aboard, 12 rowers and an engineer and a captain. In the end, we had 16 people. For the next few minutes, I did what I always did during cold nights on watch, enacted a tiny private indulgence, let us say a comfort, by wrapping my hands around the flimsy metal stanchion, the post that supported the running light atop the cabin. And there I stood, as tranquil as Aquinas at prayer. While the light's plastic housing shed no warmth, the chromed metal post that held it aloft transmitted a matchstick's worth of heat from the electrical activity inside. But compared to the weather, it was as soothing as a wood stove in the Arctic, perhaps the only item warmer than the human body within 100 miles of the boat. As I absorbed the benefits of this pitiful dollhouse furnace, A wave exploded over the bridge, putting me ankle deep in brine. As the flood dropped, a small, dark shadow fluttered in behind me, pushed by the wind, and a little black bird, a storm petrel, thwapped off the cabin door and was suddenly at my feet on the bridge, apparently as surprised as I by the turn of events. For nearly 3 weeks I had watched with great respect as these delicate bat-like irregulars bopped along the wave tops, pulling up tiny surface fish with their dangling and witchy feet. What I did not know at the time, it would have increased my respect significantly, is that these 4-ounce strafe artists never alight, either on water or land, except for 2 or 3 weeks a year, during which they fly to distant islands to breed. Immediately my little visitor was aswim on the painted plywood, thrashing its limp legs, while its weight rested on its spread wings and belly. Initially I believed it must be injured, or perhaps just exhausted. I knew the feeling. It wasn't until I had watched the thing struggle for a few seconds, unsure of what to do to help, that the truth dawned on me. The bird's longish legs and claws were so well adapted to snatching up tiny fish that they had become entirely too spindly for walking. Pained by its thrashing, I reached down and picked it up, quickly discovering the other thing aboard that was warmer than the human body, and considerably softer. I closed my hand over it, holding its wings gently in place until its eyelids fluttered and closed and it went calm. Intimacy was nothing new aboard, but the daily intimacy of naked bodies and raw emotions at close quarters seemed suddenly impertinent compared to the more primitive enunciation of the little winged creature whose heart and nerves and whose uncertain fate had quickly become one with my own. 10 minutes later, I would hold the bird high, would open my hands and expel it into the night, unsure whether I was saving or dooming it, and would rejoice with it in miniature as it caught an updraft and was gone. But for now it sat, poignantly and crushably vulnerable, in the hands of a stranger on a turbulent night in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, every instinct undoubtedly telling it that the jig was up, that this is how it ends. For our purposes, of course, it is not how it ends, but how it begins, always. A dark and stormy night, an ocean, a boat, a cast of strangers, a blackbird, a story, a storyteller. Listen up. And so our story begins. You can see on this slide the route we took. The idea was to come, I don't know how much cord I've got here, I guess quite a bit. The idea was to come down the coast of Africa, row hard. We had hoped within 5 days to be into the trade winds and out, which flow this way, and the Gulf Current comes across the top, back over. But to get into the trade winds and get moving out there. As I say, our aim being to get across in 33 days. I'm just going to give you a few that is our magical craft, 38 feet long, 2 hulls. Never before had a rowboat tried to attempt to row the Atlantic, a 2-hulled rowboat. And the idea was that with 4 rowers on each hull, there were only 3 when that picture was taken. It was close to shore. But with 4 rowers on each side, it would give more power to the boat than was taken away by the extra hull being in the water. It didn't quite work that way, but anyway, that was our beautiful boat, and that little cabin in the middle was about the size of a Volkswagen van. And when it got really rough, as it did on the night I was describing, we would have 14 people in there, and which didn't always go well, as you can imagine, but we'll talk more about that in a minute. That was our starting point, Agadir, Morocco, one of the biggest ports on the west coast of Africa. And we stopped very briefly on the edge of the Sahara Desert at a little town called Tarfaya. had some adventures there briefly. And that was our finishing point at Port St. Charles in Barbados. I put that slide up there not for perhaps what would seem to be the obvious reasons, but because it's one of our rowers, a woman from New York City, University of Rhode Island, an Olympic level rower named Liz Koenig. And to me, that lovely photo always exemplified the sort of maximum possibility for exuberance and joy that we experienced on the trip. That photo represents something else. We're going to get into an order here, but Louise Graff from Kentucky and South Carolina, and behind her Nigel Rohde, and I at least can see on their faces a look of very, very profound exhaustion that was part of our life out there almost all of the time, as measured against the beauty of the ocean and the skies in the background that you can see there around sunset of one of our nights. That is the chap, Steve Rohde, who got me involved. As I mentioned, he's a retired emergency room doctor living on St. Joseph Island. That was the first night we saw the boat. And in the middle there, between Louise and Nigel, you can see me in the background. And that was a wonderful night for us. For nearly a year, we had thought about this boat and dreamed about it. And when we finally saw it, there was a Shelter Island outside of New York City on Long Island. It was for most of us not only a moment, but an evening of great excitement. The following morning, this was our only training together, a weekend in late November of 2010. We proceeded down to the water off Long Island, and like a Chaucerian parade or something, and the boat was hardly ready yet. Put it in the sea and took off for a kind of experimental row. And at the time, we were going with heavy currents, and it just seemed to us there was nothing on the boat. It was, nothing in terms of luggage or food or heavy electronics equipment, all of the stuff that would eventually be there. So the boat was light and fast. And in our hearts, we believed that we were going to row across the ocean in 32 or 33 days at that point. Just before New Year's 2010, we boarded these big Air Maroc jets in either New York or Montreal, and we headed across. That is the, what's the great capital city there? Morocco, not the capital, but just north of it. I've got Constantinople. What is it? No. Casablanca, right, yeah. And we landed in Casablanca, got on another flight, a little flying coffin of a thing, and flew down over the mountains to Agadir. And it was really in Agadir that our adventure began. The boat had been shipped over on a container vessel over the holidays and arrived in Agadir. We unpacked it beginning on New Year's Eve and gradually pieced the thing together. It was a somewhat different boat now, a more elaborate and technological boat than it had been when we first rowed it in New York. In the boatyard there in Morocco, it was kind of interesting in the port of Agadir. This beautiful white yacht you see in the background was quite a fascination for the kids aboard because it belonged to somebody from the rock band Pink Floyd. So the kids were very, very fascinated by that and was in for apparently $1 million refit or something like that. We continued to unload it, to put it together, and proceeded into a 10 or 12 day period of getting the thing ready to go and getting ourselves ready. You can see it shaping up there. These are the life rafts, the inflatable life rafts, and we had by this time had solar power on the boat, 4 solar panels. Wind generators on the back. You can see the seats installed there and the rowing trenches. We had one thing we had not had originally was there was originally to be no toilet aboard, and which created problems for some people. Mental problems before they went out. We had by this time switched captains. The captain I mentioned in the little preliminary video, a guy called Roy Finley, left the expedition. The word embezzlement was used. I don't know exactly what the details were, but for a period of time, we were without a captain, a possible captain for taking the row, and there was every possibility that thing might not go. We eventually were able to find a rower. She's paraplegic, but a wonderful rower, Angela Madsen from Long Beach, California, and she signed on as captain. And so the first thing she insisted on was a toilet. We were going to have a little toilet. She was a grandmother, and she claimed that a grandmother could not be aboard a boat that didn't have a toilet. So in this little hold here, a little sea toilet was installed. And the other thing she wanted, there was originally to be no cooking facilities, and she wanted something that would at least heat water. So once again, she said that grandmother has to have her tea. So she wasn't a very old grandmother, mind you, but the installation of these, this is a piece of kind of trampoline-like cloth that extended from the cabin here out to the hulls on both sides, and we called it the trampoline, and it took a long time to get it installed, but it gave us a little bit of extra room for walking around out there. We stayed in Morocco in an almost unbelievably hoorish little apartment in the back streets, and 12 of the guys all lived there, with the exception of David the builder. And you can see it's quite rococo, and no art or anything on the walls, and a little horrifying little bathroom with cold water, and even the red light was still installed over the door. So it gave me pause to wonder what might have actually gone on there. I keep that picture in there because it seems faintly kind of, I don't know, medieval or Elizabethan or something to me. Myself standing here, our oldest rower, Tom Butcher. At one time, I was to be the oldest rower out there, but then a former Canadian speed skating champion named Tom Butcher signed on, and he was at the time 67. And is still, I think, the oldest guy to row across the Atlantic. Steve Rohde, the boat's builder, David Dablianidze here, and Dylan White, a young musician and biologist from Guelph. We spent those days, as I say, getting ready. The oars, when you're out there, your oar is kind of your Stradivarius, and if it's dysfunctional or in any way giving you problems, you can't row, and because just the demands of rowing were so great. So Ryan Worth, fantastic rower from the University of Tennessee, and Liam Flynn, a terrific British rower, 2 young guys, took on the job of replacing the handles on the oars. And most big racing oars these days have a sort of a neoprene handle, but because of the salt water and the endlessness of the rowing, we had lovely white oak handles, which were much easier on the hands actually than the neoprene or the rubber. I keep this photo in here for another reason, because it is sort of, I had worked hard to get myself fit and had actually put on about 10 pounds of, unbelievable though it might seem for someone viewing me now, about 10 pounds of extra muscle that gave me a little bit of heft. And it is somewhat mildly apparent in this picture, as it certainly was not 53 days later when I was down to 135 pounds. There's Ryan working on the oars. Food. Endless amounts of food. When the captain had been Roy Finley, he believed that we would get along on 5,000 calories a day. But the new captain, Angela, believed that 10,000 calories a day would be required. So we had that boat crammed with, I gotta think, a ton of food, all packaged into little kind of plastic bits and pieces and wraps and so on, and specific meals and all of that. I mentioned that I ran low on food. Well, I did because I had a lot of faith in the boat and the power of the people aboard, and believed we would get across more quickly than we did. And also, we chose our own food. And you don't know what you're going to want to eat when you're exhausted and fried and can hardly remember your own name and every element of your body is in revolt. You think, I'm going to want to eat this or that or the other thing, and you don't. You want to eat something else, and we shall talk a little more about that. There's me with some of my prepackaged food. Some of the people had kind of homemade granola and all of that kind of thing. There's our captain, Angela, who had that little stowage place in the front of the cabin for her headquarters, putting away a bit of food. That's the boat's builder, David Davlianidze, a wonderful guy who basically escaped from Georgia after the Civil War there, was toting a gun one week and managed to get himself into a farming program that run by the U.S. and that brought him to Hawaii, where he was working on a pineapple farm. Decided he didn't like it, but he liked the U.S., so he went on a sort of a 2-year run from immigration and managed to stay like a step ahead of them and ended up working illegally in a boatyard in Florida and learned how to build boats, and that is why he was able to build the boat that eventually would take us across the Atlantic. About, I'm going to say 24 hours before we departed, Steve and I decided we would get our hair cut off, basically. And never a wise thing to do, but anyway, it seemed like it might work on the... We got in there, and this lovely chap, the barber, I believe the place was called the Coiffure Paris, a very sophisticated place, and his younger brother were quite happy to see us and asked us immediately if we would like some Moroccan whiskey. And, you know, Agadir is a very dusty, sort of dry place, so anything anybody offered you to drink, of course you said sure. The younger chap disappeared for, I'm going to say, about 90 seconds and came back with 2 glass tumblers full of a warm, enticing amber fluid. And we immediately knocked it back. And Steve said to me as he got out of the chair, "Did you catch what we're drinking?" And I thought, no, not really. It tasted like a sort of peppermint tea to me. Well, as it turned out, and I thought there was something slightly kind of, I won't say suspicious about it, but unusual. It was a very, very, very strong marijuana tea. And so we had gone into the barber, and I had had a slight paranoia in my head about infection from little cuts and so forth, and the nicks and all of that, and hepatitis that is passed along easily in these various warm parts of the world. And having drunken this like really, really strong marijuana tea, I could feel the clippers as if I believed I could feel them snapping off each individual hair. We embarked after that on a semi-psychedelic tour of the back streets of Agadir, and it was simultaneously a kind of dream, but also a nightmare, because I seemed to feel very powerfully a sort of a paranoia about being in a foreign city, a Muslim city, with stoned illegally, and facing this journey ahead of me. I don't know why I tell you so much detail on that, but it was a powerful night, because it gave me insights and a sort of a perspective on what was to come that I do not know that I would have had otherwise. There's the boat pretty much ready to go. And the morning came, finally, on which we were putting the thing in the ocean for good or bad. And it was well loaded, I can tell you. As I say, there was food, there was electronics equipment, there was everybody's gear. There were 2 extra people than we'd originally planned. We gradually worked it down to the launching place in the old port. You can see we had it rolling on these dollies, and slipped it. Agadir is the biggest sardine port in the world, and it is just a hive of activity, with boats coming and going, dories and trawlers and so forth, and got the thing into the water finally with the help of some Moroccans. As you can see, it was quite a sort of a festivity amongst the people around the docks. Got the thing going, and immediately when it was in the water, we were not leaving till the next day, but in the water, the thing wallowed a bit, and I believed I could feel it very certainly, and it just seemed so heavy compared to what it had been in New York. But anyway, we were very optimistic and rowed it over to the marina end of things, and proceeded with our final. I like to say about this picture that it reminds me of the old aphorism that the smiling man is the one who has not yet heard the bad news. And it was taken about 10 minutes before we got on our boat at 8 o'clock on the morning of, I guess it was January the 11th, 2011, and rowed out of the port of Agadir. There were smallish boats around us taking pictures and so on as we left the port, which is how these photos taken from the exterior of the boat exist. Captain Angela. People say, did you see a lot of boats out there? And yes, we did. We saw a tremendous number of boats all the time. And you would think that the fear would be from the big container ships and so forth, but when you're in the shipping lanes off Africa, it is not those boats that are the potential problem for you. It's the little sort of rust buckets out of Mauritania or other, with a load of coconuts aboard or something, and no proper lights and no navigational equipment, and you don't know where they are and they don't know where you are, and they may or may not have radar or may not even be awake. And so we would watch pretty closely at night for vessels. We were hot bunking, as they say, which always struck me as a wonderful verb, to hot bunk. It sounds sexier than it is. That was my hot bunk partner, Sylvain Croteau, an emergency room physician from Hull, Quebec. And basically, when I was in the bunk, he wasn't. He was up on deck rowing, and when he was rowing, I was in the bunk. Unless during the daylight hours, when, of course, we weren't always sleeping. But Louise Graff, I mentioned her already, fairly experienced rower from Charleston, South Carolina, originally from Kentucky. Tom Butcher, who I mentioned. Ernst Feibe, wonderful guy, an Austrian guy. And I think for me, one of the most interesting people aboard. He was probably our best athlete, had been a high-level soccer player in the Austrian First Division. And but the interesting thing that would catch my attention every day was the impeccable hygiene that he maintained out there aboard a boat without proper water, without soap, without any particular facilities for keeping oneself neat and clean. He would shave himself every day from head to toe, and then have a little shower. We each had a sort of a little allotment of fresh water, and he would use his fresh water not to drink, but to like have a mini shower after every 2-hour watch, 6 of them a day, and then would spray himself with Givenchy cologne and come into the cabin, which was otherwise known as the gas chamber for obvious enough reasons. So, and also was a very funny guy who entertained us royally. Alexa Klimas Mikalauskas, originally from Lithuania, now from Long Island, good strong college rower. Margaret Bowling. Margaret was an unusual gal from Tasmania. She had been brought aboard at the last minute because she had rowed the Atlantic before and understood navigation, and it was thought that she would bring a sense of discipline to this otherwise somewhat unwieldy patchwork crew. Unfortunately, the unwieldy patchwork crew had developed over a period of 12 months of preparation some very, very specific and tight emotional attachments to one another, and were not likely to take kindly to somebody coming in at the last moment and start ordering them around. And for all Margaret's skills, she was a great rower and knew navigation. She had absolutely no personal skills. And so the crew, once she arrived 2 days before we were to depart, went into a sort of species of revolt, which will come up in the subsequent slides here. The three amigos, as I call them: Nigel Rohde, the son of the doctor who brought me aboard, Zach Scher, a firefighter and student from Guelph, and my friend Dylan White, a musician and biologist from Guelph. Liz Koenig, who's back, you saw earlier, staring off the front of the boat, terrific rower, collegiate rower from Long Island. Rhode Island, and Louise, and up in the back here, Liam Flynn. We had people say, did anybody fall in love out there? Well, actually, I won't get into it right now. It's well described in the book. But indeed, Liz and Liam did fall in love aboard the boat, and it was quite an interesting, you can see them there. And do they look like people who have fallen in love? Sort of. And anyway, it turned out to be quite a tale. And I will avoid telling you more about that or reading you anything more right now, unless you... How much time have we got? That's a key. What kind of a time frame are we operating on? What's that? It's what? And how late do we stay? What? Sorry? Oh, 11, eh? So we're done. Let's speed up a little here then. We won't get into the love story. We stopped at, we're going to need another 20 minutes here. I hope you can stay with it. We stopped briefly. We were going so slowly in our attempt to get into the trade winds that we had to stop and start over. So we pulled ashore at Tarfaya on the edges of the Sahara Desert. And it was quite a time of turmoil. Tom, at this stage, Tom Butcher, the 67-year-old chap who I mentioned, had picked up a terrible internal infection, intestinal infection, and was bleeding in all the wrong places and lying on his bunk moaning all day and night. And Angela, the captain, wanted him to basically abandon ship and get on a bus and take bus across the Sahara back to Agadir and go home. And he did not want to do that. And fortunately, at Agadir, just at the point when he was about to give up, there he is sitting there, although he looks better there than he actually felt, Ernst, the shaving Givenchy Austrian, said to him, we had 3 doctors aboard, and they had plied him with antibiotics and so forth, and he was showing no signs of improvement and basically thought he was dying. Ernst said to him, I have some super Imodium. And Tom, I almost guarantee you, if you take this, you'll get better. He said, 1 pill, pardon the expression, but this is exactly what he said. You won't shit for 2 days. 2, and you won't shit till Barbados. Take 3, Tom, and you'll never shit again. Right? And as you can imagine, SHIT was one of the great problems here. Anyway, Tom took 3. And within an hour, was hale and chipper and walking around and thinking, I'm going, I'm fine. And he did. And we embarked, and he never looked back from that point forward. The doctors weren't too pleased with the home pharmaceuticals that Ernst administered. For the next, we intended to be in the trade winds within a day or 2 from here. And thus we rode, and we rode, and we rode. And the winds were not quite right. We rode all night, we rode all day, and we rode some more, and we rode some more, and we rode some more, and we could not locate the trade winds. There is Steve scraping some of the barnacles off the hull, which had to be done every few days. We were becalmed. We would end up in fierce headwinds and couldn't move. Sometimes the kids would go swimming there, and I never was too comfortable swimming because there were a lot of sharks around all the time, and it made me a little bit nervous. And we rode some more, and we rode some more, constantly seeking these elusive trade winds. And you might think, well, why wouldn't you just go where they are? Well, they move around, or they go up, or they go down, or they cease entirely, or, I mean, they're a sort of they're not like 401 highway. Our controls shelf, Margaret taking a little swig of water out of the desalination equipment, which worked pretty much full time and provided us with enough water for drinking and a little bit for cleaning and so forth. The day came when, after some people had given up, when we felt a slightly different wind behind us. And I thought, this may be it. Well, we were 20 days out already, and we'd hoped to be in the trade winds in 5 days. And this came in the afternoon. By dinner hour, there was this steady push of wind behind us, maybe 20, 30 kilometers an hour, and increasingly high waves. By dark, we were being pushed by 30 and 40-foot waves, sometimes 50-foot waves, following waves, and in a 65 kilometer an hour wind that persisted then for 15 days and did not go away. I want to show you very briefly here, just give you a little bit of a sense of what it was like to be out there in those winds. And one more little bit of a sense of it. I have another piece of video here that I want to show you. One of the problems was that having had a relatively easy time of rowing thus far, we were suddenly in a position where if you went overboard, you were gone. And so the whole tone of things changed. And the reason you were gone is that the boat could no longer be stopped. The rowers didn't have enough power to turn it around and go back into the wind to fetch somebody if they fell over. And the kids who'd never used their lifelines at all, their safety lines, were still not using their safety lines, even though the older fogies like me were buckled up double all the time. But it traumatized me to see the kids moving around without proper safety harness and so forth. One of the things was that when we had a crosswind, you would constantly have to be peering off to the side to catch waves, to see waves coming that often went right over the boat and could take you with them if you weren't watching. This little bit of video just gives you a bit of a sense of what I mean by these cross waves that come. Constant battering of waves, which was, of course, tiring physically and very draining mentally for the rowers. Where were we here? Anyway, the days got rough and rougher, and as you could see the wind in people's hair, the exhaustion on the faces of the kids there. Dylan, you can see there what would happen is a wave would come from the side, and you can see Sylvain has lost control of his oar there. And this happened quite frequently if you weren't like a really top-notch rower, and I certainly was not. So I got 3 teeth knocked out actually on being hit by the oar handle. Nigel concentrating in the waves. One thing that happened to me, I should have mentioned it initially, but this is as good a time as any. The first night out, I'd had this very carefully chosen gel seat cushion. And when you're rowing out there on these hard wooden seats for 2 hours at a stretch, 12 hours a day, your seat cushion is your prayer shawl and your shield and your anything, your breastplate, anything you can imagine in terms of metaphor. It is absolutely necessary. And I had it under my arm in a period of time of exhaustion the first night, and without thinking reached out for something, and it went boing, boing, boing into the ocean. And one of the laws of the boat was if it goes in, we don't turn back for it. And this was to me a bit of a mystery, but so my seat cushion was gone. I did 2 shifts, 2 2-hour shifts without it. Tore up my backside, something fierce, and finally realized that if I was going to survive this venture, I had to figure out something in the way of a seat pad. So I pieced together this little bit of sponge and, of course, duct tape. You know, I watch Red Green like everybody else. So. With the rougher weather, injuries. It wasn't just a mental state and a sort of a mortality fear. It was physical injuries. People's feet started getting torn up because your shoes are always full of salt water, and you can't go in the stirrups without shoes, or you don't have protection from the stirrups themselves. One of the other difficulties we faced out there was what they call salt sores. You're constantly soaked in salt water, and the salt water gradually works its way into the skin and underneath and forms little pockets of salt water which burst outwards and form blisters that either form scabs and go away or do not. And you're looking at Alexis's legs there, and she must have had 5,000 salt sores on here. We all had them, but she had them worse than anybody, I think. There she is, feeling rather sorry for herself one day in the cabin. I got a terrible cut right down to the bone one night in my shin, and it created some difficulties at home. We had contact with land via satellite phone, and somehow it got back to my kids that I had been taken off the boat because of this leg injury. And I had told the kids before I went, I have 3 children, nobody gets taken off the boat because, of course, once you're 100 kilometers offshore, there isn't a helicopter that can come out. It doesn't have that range to come out into the middle of the ocean and get you. So you either die out there or you get better. And the big tourist boats and so forth are not going to turn around and come 200 kilometers to fetch somebody goofy enough to be out there on a little rowboat. Fortunately, we had lots of antibiotics and several doctors, as I mentioned, and within a matter of days, my leg was pretty much healed up. You can see the cabin there, the sometimes called gas chamber, which was so crowded with stuff. You cannot imagine the sense of crowding in there. We had these little pygmy bunks, 4 of them on each side of a sort of a 1.5 wide alleyway. One night it was so crowded in there when we were all in there because we could not proceed. We couldn't move forward, so we called off rowing and put the sea anchor out. And I was up front here, toward the front, and at a certain point thought, I have to pee. I have to get out of here and pee. And stood up and tried to move and realized I cannot get out of here. I'm trapped in here, and what to do? I was one of 4 people kind of crammed into the little plywood alleyway between the bunks. And I remembered at that point that I had seen over a period of days a stainless steel water bottle rolling around on the floor, and thought, if I could just find it. It's pitch black in there. I locate it. I fill it within like a millimeter of the brim. Turn the top back on, or maybe didn't, and sat there upright in the corner, put the thing under my jacket. At night it would be cold enough that you'd want a snowboard jacket on, and during the day, down by the equator, it would be 95, 100 degrees. I put it under there, and it was warm. It was so lovely that I had this little private heating unit and held it there, fortunately without spilling anything, till dawn, and excused myself, went outside, dumped it, cleaned it up. Never told anybody what their water bottle had been used for. You can see things tended to get a little rather intimate in the cabin at times, not in an unseemly way, but people decided at a certain point that because of the salt in your clothing, which would just get to drive you crazy. It would be itching in any little cuts or whatever, and so people basically, when the trip was 2 weeks old, a lot of people had pretty much given up on clothing entirely. One of the things that sustained us so beautifully out there was what I came to think of as the sort of great cosmological opera. And amidst all this privation and so on, and hunger, and often disputes among crew people and antagonisms, the wildlife out there certainly never let me down, or the beauty of the planet. That is not a good picture, but there were constantly dolphins dancing around the boat, sometimes in great numbers, and occasionally whales would come right up to the boat rather ominously at night. I remember at night hearing off the port bow, this great rasping heave of breath on a calm night when we were rowing, and realizing that there was a whale out there within perhaps 100 feet of the boat. And sure enough, seconds later, this kind of barnyard smell of its great kind of breath came floating over the boat. That was a pilot whale, not a very good picture. That's what a pilot whale looks like. And what you were seeing there was the little hump on the forehead and the tail, of course. All sorts of whales and many sharks and many flying fish. People have asked me why we didn't eat the flying fish as they, proliferated around the boat, and there'd be 200 of them in the air sometimes. The little ones we came across out there would often land on the tramps, but they were hard, often kind of smelly little things by the time we found them, and not particularly what you would want to be biting the head off. What we tried to catch were the dolphin fish, or the dorado as some people call them, or maui-maui on the Pacific, mahi-mahi, excuse me. And they were constantly around the boat, these beautiful dorado. That's one right there, with the great sort of sawtooth fin and the underbite. And we couldn't catch them, but I didn't really want to catch them anyway, because they were so beautiful to have around. And no excuse for starving, but one of the lovely things that would happen was they'd come up to the oars. They were very curious, and they'd nibble at the ends of the oars. And because the oars were a very, very delicate graphite, durable, but high tech, the biting at the end of the oar would come up the oar shaft like 14 feet, just like an electrical current into your hands. And you'd get this very unusual sense of connection to what was down there. Lots of sharks. I think that's a tiger shark. Lots of squid. The squid would land on the tarp, and they'd often be there in the morning. Man-o-war, highly toxic to humanity anyway, dangling long tentacles into the water, thousands of them in the water all the time. Leatherback turtles, loggerhead turtles. The turtles were something to me. You'd see them out there rowing along, swimming from Florida over to northern waters off northern Europe. And I learned later that they operate in very, very narrow highways out on the ocean. And one of the things I feared, in a sense, going out there was the sort of loss of perspective on the planet. I thought, you're out there, and I'd always thought of the ocean as this great amorphous gray body of water. And when I got out there, that affects our sense of who we are, because we connect very intimately with our surroundings on the planet. When we got out there, I discovered that the boat was very central to everything. The waves were a kind of a fleeting sense of positioning. The horizon was the next ring out. At night, the North Star was over here. The sun came up over here, it went down over here. The moon came up over here, it went down here. The winds were predominantly they were westbound. There was a very, very strong sense, actually, of being in a specific place, and particularly if you started thinking about what was below, because boats that had been traveling from Africa and the Mediterranean to the New World as far back as 600 years ago, or further back if you go back to the Vikings or the Norsemen, they always took that route over. And there were thousands of ships down there, including all the horrific kind of wastage of the slave trade and all of that. And you would be over mountains. And it gradually gave me a very strong sense of place. But nothing gave me the sense of place more than the whales and dolphins and fish, the turtles, because they are not out there on random patterns. The turtle has magnetite in its brain, and it reads the magnetic fields of the planet. And it will go from Florida over to, as I say, the waters off northern Europe, and stay within a very narrow highway, as specific to us as, say, 401 would be from one side of the province to the other. And if they go too far north, it gets too cold, they don't have food. They go too far south, it's too warm for them, etc. So they're on these routes, as are the whales, the gray whales, and the dolphins, and they're all doing their patterns out there. So, I mean, in a sense, it all provided a kind of sense that this was not at all just amorphous gray water. There's a little storm petrel of the type I read about earlier. They have a desalinator in their somewhere in their upper body, and when they take in salt water, they spit the salt out that little bump on top of their beaks, and that way are able to get fresh water when otherwise they would not be able to. The sunsets were always gorgeous and encouraging at times when there was little to feel encouraged about out there, when we were 20 days behind schedule and hungry and exhausted to the point where you didn't know whether your organs were going to hold up for another day. All of these things were a kind of sustenance that for an older guy like me enabled me to kind of appreciate the planet and food. When I went aboard, I took 96 Cliff Bars, thinking these will be perfect. They're loaded with protein and other good stuff. I ate 2 Cliff Bars the first day, and if you've ever eaten a Cliff Bar, you know that 2 of them is enough to sustain you for the rest of your life, more or less. That's all you need, right? So I had 94 of them left. When I ran out of food, I chewed my way like Pac-Man through 94 Cliff Bars. And then when they were gone, this basically ran out of food when there were 8 days to go. Some people had brought aboard a product called Squeezer's cheese, which was advertised as like real cheese in a little package, in a 1-ounce package. And all of the people who had brought 50 packs of this aboard had eaten 1 pack and decided that they had had enough for a lifetime and had stowed them. So I knew that there were 350 or 400 packs of Squeezer's cheese aboard. That was my next stop. I gathered them all up and I plowed through those over a course of several days. Then on to emergency food rations, which you can see here have a 5-year shelf life. I saw Liam Flynn one morning. We're almost done here. I saw Liam Flynn eating some yellowish matter, and I said to him, "Liam, what are you eating?" And he said, "Well, it's emergency rations." And I said, "What's it like?" And he said, "Well, it's like a sort of a lemony, dense shortbread." Now, when you haven't eaten properly in 5 days and you're rowing 12 hours a day, a dense lemony shortbread sounded like absolutely the best possible thing anybody had ever tasted in their life. So I immediately plowed through a couple of packs of emergency rations. I want to read you one little piece in conclusion here before we see the last couple of pictures. I'll just find it. It pertains to food. And I mentioned earlier the realities of being disconnected from the planet. Well, there is no disconnection from the planet like going hungry and being unable to sustain oneself on the planet's wonderful fruits. And as it was, this is day 50 or so, or 48 maybe. As it was, I felt like a farm goat. I'm very hungry at this point and very skinny. An animal whose instincts for selective grazing attracted first to the tenderest grasses and vegetables, then to chewier greens such as asters and chicory, and so on down through what's available in the pasture, this is the farm goat, to the tougher stuff, until finally it is eating thistles and burdock and even tree bark. While not literally eating thistles, I'd have been happy to get some. I had hit a new low the previous evening when what came out of the galley for me was a packet of Sicilian polenta that had not been rehydrated at all. With the boat rocking as fiercely as it was, there was simply no way of heating water. Thus, rather than the enticing mushy cornmeal I had anticipated in reading the, quote, heirloom recipe on the packet, I was faced with a kind of sand soup, grittier than 2-grade aggregate, and about as tasty. I chewed down a spoonful or two of it, went out, sent the rest of it to its reward, and then, as usual these days, went scrounging through the reject bag, where people put food they didn't want or couldn't eat. The reject bag for granola bars or packets of peanut butter or odds and ends of candy or cookies. You never knew what somebody might have thrown to the bottom feeders while you were out keeping a slim. A few seconds later, as I was about to quit my excavation, I was astounded to come across a commercially foil-packed chicken breast, realizing only as I pulled it free that there was a small tear in the packaging. A warning that included the minuscule icon of a skull said, "Do not eat if seal has been broken." I stared for several seconds at the forbidden fruit, reluctant to ask anybody what they thought. If they advised me not to eat it, and I did anyway and died, I'd look rather silly. He knowingly ate rotten meat. Even dogs know better. In a curious inversion, perhaps known best to the very desperate or hungry, I found myself asking not, what if it's bad, but what if it's good? Therein hung the risk, as I perceived it. I could be missing out. I read the warning again, looking for loopholes, then read the small print and realized the package contained nitrates, preservatives, at which point I ducked into my bunk and opened it, convincing myself that the slightly garbagey smell and the bluish pallor of the chicken was just the poor cabin air and light. Using an old trick of my dad's to test wild mushrooms, I placed the teensiest of fragments on my tongue and determined that at very least a molecule wouldn't kill me, and took a wee bite and waited, and then a bigger one, and then engulfed the thing almost without chewing, and promptly fell asleep and woke up alive, at least alive enough to go out and row. Hold on. It's hard to manipulate pages with a microphone in your hand. We're almost done here. To go out and row, which is what this sport is all about. That and world records. Never has there been a sport so obsessed with world records for rowing across the Atlantic from the east, for rowing across the Atlantic from the west, for rowing across the Atlantic from all other directions. It is with restrained pride I report that while one record eluded us aboard the boat, we did claim another, or at least I did, for speed and distance in the projection of a chicken breast out the esophagus, west of the mid-Atlantic ridge. I will not linger on the feat, except to say that about 20 minutes into the evening watch, I was gripped by a brief but intense nausea, followed by a rumbling in the stomach. I barely had time to link these to my big score of 2 hours earlier, when my throat opened like a birth canal, my abdomen contracted, and a somewhat molested-looking loaf of greenish yardbird shot out of me at the speed of a Katyusha rocket and disappeared over the horizon. All of this so noiselessly and delicately as to go unnoticed by those laboring in the trench before me. Actually, Dylan did turn to me about 30 seconds later and said, "Did you hear something?" "Like what?" I said. "I thought I heard a kind of whump," he said. "Probably the chicken hitting a cargo vessel somewhere off the coast of South America." When we finally saw I'm giving you here a very, very short tour of the trip and of the forces and currents at work amongst the people and the murderous intent and the great camaraderie and all of that. But finally we saw came in the distance to within the sight of Barbados, and I had expected it to rise out of the sea as we approached, because of the curvature of the earth, but instead it appeared whole through the mists, and we were within shot of it. I had quite a severe abrasion on my cheekbone, because 2 nights before we got there I had fallen asleep in the trench, as I often did when I was rowing, and woke up only as my head hit the gunwale. I promised Alexa I would never ever show that picture. So don't tell her. Here we are coming to within sight of Port St. Charles, and we were a pretty happy bunch. I would say giddy at that point. Everybody had their clothes on and whatever else they needed to look like human beings. And there we are coming in, getting closer. There were some people who had come to greet us, friends and relatives and so on. And you can see it was quite an emotional time coming into the harbor there and being greeted by our friends and relatives. And there's me with a couple of friends. We went from all of that pretty heavy kind of pressure and what the word I've used is privation, maybe it's a little strong, but into the relative lap of luxury, as they say, for a few days before we headed back, and all the great fruits of the land. There we are on a few minutes after we arrived in our final picture. And time to cut it off. And as I say, I have only given you the tiniest glimpse. The bad news always is that writers write books, and if you would like to get the full humor and murderous impact of the trip, you might like to enjoy reading this book. I've got some of them out there. They're $20, and one of the things you always have to endure when there's a writer involved is the fact that he will probably pitch the book. So, meanwhile, you've been a very gracious audience, and I realize that we've been here for much longer than advertised. And thank you ever so much for coming out. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. And Charles, thank you so much. That was just very entertaining. Second time I've heard it, and what an adventure. Please give him a big hand.
preceding program was brought to you by Bruce Telecom and Whiteman TV,